August 24th, 1942. 14,000 feet above the Solomon Sea, 50 miles northeast of Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Flatley scanned the sky through his F-4F Wildcat's canopy, squinting against the tropical sun that turned the ocean below into a sheet of hammered silver. The engine roared in front of him. Loud, dependable, brutally American. Sweat soaked his flight suit despite the altitude. The temperature gauge read normal. Oil pressure good. Fuel sufficient for another 90 minutes of combat air patrol. Everything was fine except for the 72 Japanese aircraft heading straight toward the American task force. "Scarlet Leader, this is Big Dog." The voice crackled through Flatley's headset, the fighter direction officer aboard USS Saratoga, watching the radar plot that showed what was coming. Vector 270. Angels 12? Large raid inbound? Estimate 60 plus bandits. Flatley keyed his radio. "Scarlet Leader copies. All Scarlet aircraft. Form on me. We're going hunting." He counted heads visually. Standard procedure because radio discipline mattered when you were outnumbered. 18 Wildcats formed up around him in 3 plane sections, their stubby wings and blunt noses making them look exactly like what Japanese pilots had been saying for 9 months. Obsolete, outclassed, doomed. The Japanese weren't entirely wrong. Flatley had flown Wildcats since before Pearl Harbor, and he knew their limitations like he knew his own weaknesses. The F-4F was slower than the Zero, maybe 30 knots slower in level flight. It couldn't turn with a Zero, couldn't climb with a Zero. In a traditional dogfight, the kind of swirling, twisting aerial knife fight that pilots dreamed about, the Zero was simply superior. Every engagement report from the early war confirmed it. The Philippines, Wake Island, Java. American pilots had died by the dozens trying to dogfight Zeros. The Zero was lighter, more agile, could turn inside anything the Allies flew. Japanese pilots treated air combat like samurai sword fighting, elegant, precise, based on superior maneuverability. They'd built the perfect fighter for 1935. Unfortunately for them, it was 1942, and the rules were about to change. "Tally-ho, bandits, 11 o'clock level!" Flatley saw them now, dark specks against white clouds, growing rapidly. He could make out the shapes. Twin-engine Betty bombers in a tight formation, and above them, weaving back and forth like protective sheepdogs, at least 3 dozen Zeros, maybe more. Hard to count when they were maneuvering. His wingman, Ensign Eric Erickson, pulled closer. The kid was 22, fresh from Pensacola, flying his first combat mission over contested airspace. Flatley could see Erickson's head swiveling, trying to track all the threats at once. "Steady, Eric. Stay on my wing. Don't chase anything." That was the key, the single lesson that separated pilots who survived from pilots who died in the first 30 seconds. Don't chase. The Zero wanted you to chase, wanted you to follow it into a turning fight where its superior maneuverability would kill you. Every instinct said to pursue, to engage individually, to prove yourself in single combat. Every instinct was wrong. "Scarlet Flight, listen up." Flatley kept his voice calm, almost conversational. "We're going through the bombers first. Ignore the fighters unless they're on your 6. 2 plane elements, mutual support. If anyone calls defensive, his wingman breaks toward the threat. Nobody fights alone. Nobody." The Japanese formation was close now, maybe 5 miles. Flatley could see the bombers clearly. 27 Betty bombers in 3 tight Vs, their glazed noses glinting in the sun. Above them, the Zeros were starting to dive, positioning themselves to intercept the American fighters before they could reach the bombers. Standard Japanese doctrine. The Zeros would sweep the sky clear of American fighters. Then the bombers would have free rein over the task force below. It had worked at Pearl Harbor, at the Philippines, in the Java Sea. Japanese naval aviation had spent the first 9 months of the war proving they owned the Pacific sky. Flatley pulled his gun sight Pipper onto the lead bomber and began his attack run. The Wildcat accelerated, not fast by Zero standards, but fast enough. Gravity helped. They were diving now, building speed, the stubby fighter vibrating as it pushed through 250 knots, then 280, then 300. The Zeros came to meet them. Flatley saw one diving from his 2 o'clock high, a textbook intercept, the Zero pilot probably already imagining the kill. The enemy fighter was beautiful in a way, all clean lines and graceful curves. It looked fast, even sitting still, and it was closing with the kind of acceleration that made the Wildcat seem like it was standing still. "Eric, brake right now!" Erickson reacted instantly, hauling his Wildcat into a hard right turn. The Zero followed, of course it followed, pulling inside Erickson's turn radius with contemptuous ease, but that put the Zero directly in front of Flatley's guns. Flatley squeezed the trigger. 6 50 caliber machine guns erupted, tracers walking across the sky toward the Zero. The Japanese fighter was so focused on Erickson that its pilot never saw Flatley's attack until rounds started hammering into his wing root. The Zero staggered, kept flying. One wing was shredded, control surfaces hanging in tatters, but the lightweight fighter maintained some semblance of flight. A testament to Japanese engineering and pilot skill. The Zero was damaged but not dead. Flatley fired again, a longer burst this time. The Wildcat's guns were heavier than the Zero's armament, American 50 cals versus Japanese 7.5 Turns and 20 mm cannon. Rate of fire versus hitting power. The debate had raged in planning rooms for years. The debate ended when the Zero's fuel tank exploded. Japanese fighters didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks, a weight-saving measure that made them more maneuverable, but also turned them into flying bombs. The Zero disintegrated in a fireball that made Flatley flinch even through the thick canopy glass. "Scarlet 3, good kill!" That was Lieutenant Marion Carl, leading the second section. "Bandits coming through high. Multiple bogeys, 12 o'clock." The sky was full of them now. Zeros diving, climbing, wheeling in the kind of aerobatic display that would have been beautiful if it wasn't trying to kill them. Flatley saw 3 Wildcats engaged with 5 Zeros. The American fighters flying in pairs, not trying to outturn their enemies, but working together. One braking while the other fired, then reversing. It was ugly compared to the Zero's graceful maneuvers. It looked defensive, even desperate. But pilots weren't dying. A Zero latched onto a Wildcat's tail, closing for the kill. Flatley started to warn the pilot, but the Wildcat's wingman was already there, firing a deflection shot that forced the Zero to break off. The 2 Wildcats reformed immediately, covering each other, denying the Zeros the isolated target they needed. This was the Thatch Weave, named for Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, who'd figured out that if American fighters couldn't outturn Zeros, they could outthink them. 2 planes, weaving back and forth, each covering the other's tail. Simple, brutally effective, and completely alien to Japanese fighter doctrine, which emphasized individual skill and single combat. Flatley pressed through toward the bombers. A Zero came head-on, a terrifying sight, the fighter growing from a speck to a threat in seconds. Both pilots fired. Flatley felt rounds hit his Wildcat, a hammering sensation through the airframe, like someone hitting the fuselage with a sledgehammer. The Zero flashed past. So close Flatley could see the pilot's face. He checked his instruments, oil pressure dropping, engine temperature rising. Rounds had hit something important. But the engine was still running, the controls still responded, and his guns still fired. The Wildcat was built like a tank. Armored cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, rugged construction that could absorb punishment that would have destroyed lighter fighters. "I'm hit but functional," he reported. continuing attack. Below him, Erik Erikson had reached the bombers. The young ensign's guns tore into a Betty, walking fire from engine to fuselage. The bomber didn't explode. Japanese aircraft were tougher than people thought, but it fell out of formation, trailing smoke, losing altitude. Probably wouldn't make it home. The battle dissolved into chaos, the kind of swirling three-dimensional knife fight where survival measured in seconds and victories measured in staying alive long enough to see another engagement. Flatley lost track of individual opponents. He fired at targets of opportunity, broke when Zeros got too close, reformed with whatever wildcats he could find. His engine was getting worse. The oil pressure gauge showed red. He had maybe 10 minutes before it seized completely. All Scarlet aircraft, this is leader. We're breaking off. Form on me, heading 180. Let's go home. They turned south, back toward the task force. Behind them, the Japanese formation was scattered, several Bettys smoking or falling, Zeros disengaging to escort the damaged bombers home. It wasn't a clean victory. Nothing about this war was clean, but it was a victory nonetheless. Flatley counted heads as they reformed. 17 Wildcats. One was trailing smoke but flying. Everyone was low on ammunition. Several, like his own, were damaged. But they were alive. And they'd stopped 72 Japanese aircraft with 19 fighters that the enemy had dismissed as obsolete. The oil pressure gauge hit 0. Flatley's engine seized with a grinding shudder that he felt through his boots. The propeller windmilled to a stop. He was 30 miles from the carrier at 8,000 feet in a dead fighter over shark-infested water. Jimmy Flatley smiled. He had altitude, he had airspeed, and he had a Wildcat that glided like a brick, but still glided. Obsolete. The Japanese could keep saying it. Maybe they'd even believe it. Right up until the moment when 19 obsolete fighters proved that superior tactics, better construction, and sheer American stubbornness could beat Japanese technological advantage. Flatley aimed for the carrier and began his long, engineless glide home. Flatley made it back to the Saratoga on fumes and prayer, or rather, on altitude and aerodynamics. The dead Wildcat had glided like a streamlined anvil, losing height at a rate that made every mile feel like a gamble. He'd touched down on the carrier deck with no engine, no hydraulic pressure, and a landing gear that deployed through sheer mechanical stubbornness. The arresting hook caught the wire. The Wildcat stopped. Deck crews swarmed the aircraft before he'd even unbuckled. "Sir, your bird's shot to hell," the plane captain said, examining the bullet holes. "Count 17 hits. Engines gone. Hydraulics severed. Aileron control cables half cut. How'd you even make it back?" Flatley climbed out, legs shaking from adrenaline crash. "Grumman builds them tough." It was true. The F-4F Wildcat was built by Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, a company that would later earn the nickname Grumman Iron Works for building aircraft that refused to die even when they should. While the Zero sacrificed durability for performance, the Wildcat was armored, redundant, overbuilt. It was the difference between a rapier and a broadsword. In the early months of the war, that difference had seemed meaningless. December 1941, the Philippines. American pilots had taken Wildcats, some still in their factory paint, against seasoned Japanese aviators flying Zeros. The results had been catastrophic. The Zero could outclimb, outturn, and outmaneuver American fighters with contemptuous ease. Pilots who tried traditional dogfighting tactics died. Entire squadrons were wiped out in weeks. The after-action reports made grim reading. One pilot wrote, "Attempting to dogfight the Zero is suicide. The aircraft can turn inside anything we have. When American pilots try to maneuver with them, they die." But hidden in the carnage were lessons. Pilots who survived, and there weren't many, noticed patterns. The Zero was fragile. One solid burst from 50 caliber guns and it burned. The Zero had no armor. A wounded Zero pilot usually became a dead Zero pilot. The Zero's controls stiffened at high speed, making it harder to maneuver in a dive. The Zero was unbeatable in a turning fight. So stop turning. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch had figured it out first. Thatch was a fighter tactician stationed at NAS North Island in San Diego, spending his days analyzing combat reports and running mental simulations. He'd never faced a Zero in combat, but he'd read every account of pilots who had. What he realized was simple. If you couldn't outturn the Zero, you needed tactics that didn't require turning. Thatch started experimenting with two-plane sections, having pilots fly parallel courses about 200 feet apart. When a Zero attacked one plane, that pilot would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would turn toward him. They'd cross paths, the weave, and suddenly the Zero chasing the first plane would find itself flying directly in front of the second plane's guns. On paper, it looked defensive, almost cowardly. Everything in fighter pilot culture said you should engage aggressively, seek individual combat, prove your skill in one-on-one duels. The Thatch weave looked like running away while your wingman did the shooting. In practice, it worked, and pilots who wanted to keep living started using it. February 1942. Flatley, by then commanding VF-42 aboard USS Yorktown, began drilling his pilots in the weave. They practiced for hours, flying precise patterns, learning to trust their wingmen absolutely. It felt wrong. Fighter pilots were supposed to be lone wolves, not paired dancers. But Flatley had read the same reports Thatch had. He knew that individual heroics against Zeros meant individual deaths. The Zero wants you to fight its fight, he told his pilots during a briefing. It wants you to turn. If you turn, you die. Simple as that. So we're going to fight a different fight. We're going to use teamwork, discipline, and the fact that our aircraft can take damage theirs cannot. Ensign Eric Erickson had been in that briefing, fresh from flight school, trying to reconcile everything he'd learned about aerial combat with this new doctrine. Sir, what if we get separated? What if we end up alone against a Zero? Then you dive, Flatley had said flatly. Full throttle, straight down. The Wildcat can dive faster than a Zero can follow. Get speed, get distance, get back to your wingman. Never, never try to turn with them. It sounded like cowardice. It was actually survival. May 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea. Flatley's squadron flew from Yorktown, engaging Japanese forces in the first carrier battle in history. They used the Thatch weave. They refused to dogfight. They worked in pairs, covering each other, exploiting the Wildcat's ruggedness and firepower while avoiding situations where the Zero's maneuverability mattered. They lost planes. War guaranteed that. But they didn't lose entire squadrons, and the exchange ratio started shifting from 5-1 in Japan's favor to something approaching parity. June 1942, the Battle of Midway. Thatch himself flew from USS Hornet, personally demonstrating his weave in combat. Japanese pilots, accustomed to American fighters breaking formation and engaging individually, suddenly faced coordinated pairs that refused to play by the expected rules. Zeros would latch onto a Wildcat's tail, confident in the kill, only to find themselves flying into another Wildcat's gunfire. It was ugly tactics. It lacked grace. But grace didn't win battles. After Midway, the doctrine spread throughout the Pacific Fleet. Fighter directors began assigning Wildcats in two-plane elements as standard procedure. Training syllabuses changed. New pilots learned that staying with your wingman mattered more than individual kill counts. The Japanese noticed. Intelligence intercepts from July 1942 showed confusion among Japanese naval aviators. American fighters were fighting defensively, refusing honorable combat, using cowardly group tactics. The tone was dismissive, but underneath the dismissal was something else: frustration. The Americans were learning, and the lessons were written in blood. August 1942, Guadalcanal, Henderson Field became the crucible where everything came together. The airfield, a muddy strip carved from jungle, was the focal point of a campaign that would determine control of the South Pacific. The Japanese needed it destroyed. The Americans needed it held. Every day, Japanese bombers came south from Rabaul, escorted by Zeros. Every day, Wildcats rose from Henderson Field to meet them. The pilots who flew those missions, Marine, Navy, some Army Air Force, became experts in a new kind of warfare. They learned that the Wildcat could absorb incredible punishment. Pilots came back with aircraft so shot up that ground crews couldn't believe they'd flown. One Wildcat landed with 72 bullet holes, its right aileron completely gone, fuel streaming from punctured tanks. The pilot climbed out and asked when his plane would be ready for the next mission. They learned that teamwork beat individual skill. A mediocre pilot with a good wingman could survive against ace Zero pilots. An ace pilot alone was a statistic waiting to happen. They learned that the Zero's lack of armor and self-sealing tanks was a fatal weakness. One good burst from 650 calibers could turn a Zero into a fireball. Japanese pilots had to be perfect. One mistake, one moment of exposure, and they died. American pilots could make mistakes and live. Captain Marion Carl, flying from Henderson Field, shot down his 10th Zero in early August using a tactic that would have been suicide 6 months earlier. He let a Zero get on his tail, then radioed his wingman. The wingman came in from the side, fired a 2-second burst, and the Zero disintegrated. Carl never even maneuvered. He just kept flying straight while his wingman did the work. "It feels wrong," Carl admitted later. "Everything in your training says you should be the one doing the shooting. But alive and feeling wrong beats dead and feeling heroic." The Japanese kept adapting too. Their pilots were skilled, experienced, and learning from the same brutal classroom. They started trying to separate American fighters, to isolate individuals. They began using altitude advantages more systematically. Some started flying in pairs themselves, copying the American tactic. But they were flying Zeros, aircraft designed around a doctrine that emphasized individual maneuverability. The Zero was optimized for a kind of combat that was becoming obsolete. Every design choice that made it more agile also made it more fragile. Every pound saved by eliminating armor was a pound that might have saved a pilot's life. By mid-August, the mathematics were shifting. American pilots were still being killed. This was war, and war killed people. But they were killing Japanese pilots too, and increasingly, the exchange favored the Americans. Not because the Wildcat was better than the Zero in any measurable way, but because American doctrine had evolved faster than Japanese doctrine could adapt. August 23, 1942, the night before the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Flatley sat in the Saratoga's ready room, briefing his pilots for what intelligence said would be a major Japanese push. The room smelled like coffee, sweat, and the peculiar tension that came before significant combat. "Tomorrow's going to be big," he said. "Intelligence estimates 60-plus bandits, maybe 70. They're coming for the task force, and we're all that stands between them and our ships." 19 pilots looked back at him. Some were veterans who'd been flying since before Pearl Harbor. Some, like Erickson, were so new their flight suits still looked crisp. All of them had that look, the one that came from knowing that tomorrow, mathematical probability said some of them wouldn't come back. "You know the drill," Flatley continued. "Pairs, mutual support, nobody chases, nobody tries to be a hero. We fight their aircraft, not their doctrine. The Zero wants a dogfight. We're giving them something else." He looked at the faces, at boys trying to be men, at men trying to stay alive long enough to go home. The Japanese think the Wildcat is obsolete. Let them keep thinking it. While they're thinking, we'll be shooting. Someone laughed, nervous but genuine. The tension broke slightly. That night, Flatley wrote a letter to his wife. He didn't mention the odds or the intelligence estimates, or the fact that 19 fighters against 70-plus aircraft was the kind of mathematics that kept you awake. He wrote about home, about plans for after the war, about the garden they'd plant. He sealed the letter and left it in his locker, just in case. Then he went to sleep, because tomorrow would require every bit of skill, discipline, and luck he could muster. Tomorrow, obsolete fighters would prove that doctrine mattered more than design specifications. Tomorrow, the thatch weave would face its ultimate test. August 7, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The airstrip was barely operational, 2,600 feet of packed coral and mud that the Japanese had been building when the Marines seized it 3 days earlier. Ground crews worked in 95-degree heat, refueling aircraft by hand pump, loading ammunition from crates that had been airdropped because supply ships couldn't get through. The field had no revetments, no proper maintenance facilities, no radar. What it had was location. 650 miles from Rabaul, the massive Japanese base that controlled the South Pacific. That distance, 650 miles, defined everything. Japanese bombers based at Rabaul could reach Guadalcanal, but only barely. The round trip consumed most of their fuel, leaving minimal time over target. Betty bombers, carrying 1,660 pounds of bombs each, burned 150 gallons per hour at cruise speed. The flight to Guadalcanal and back required 7 hours. They launched with 2,200 gallons, leaving approximately 150 gallons of reserve. Any combat maneuvering, any deviation from planned routing, and they wouldn't make it home. The Zeros escorting them faced identical mathematics. The A6M carried 145 gallons internally. At economical cruise, that provided maybe 6 hours of flight time. Combat operations, full throttle, evasive maneuvering, sustained engagement, consumed fuel at 3 times the normal rate. A Zero pilot fighting over Guadalcanal had perhaps 10 minutes of combat time before he had to break off and begin the long flight home. 10 minutes to shoot down American fighters, suppress ground fire, and protect the bombers. Then nothing but ocean and hope. American pilots operating from Henderson Field had no such constraints. They launched, climbed to altitude, engaged, landed, rearmed, and launched again. Some flew 4 sorties daily. A Wildcat damaged over the field could glide to a landing. A Zero damaged 650 miles from base was a dead pilot over open ocean. The mathematics favored defense. But Japanese doctrine, built around offensive operations and decisive battle, struggled to adapt. August 8th through August 20th, the daily rhythm became predictable. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft would appear at dawn, fast, high-altitude float planes that Henderson Field's fighters couldn't catch. By 1100 hours, coastwatchers on islands north of Guadalcanal would radio warnings. 27 bombers heading yours. By 1300 hours, the formation would arrive. Betty bombers in tight V formations, Zeros weaving above them. And every day, the Wildcats would climb to meet them. Marine Air Group 23, the primary fighter unit at Henderson Field, operated under conditions that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. Aircraft maintenance was performed in open air, under jungle canopy, with tools scavenged from crashed Japanese aircraft. Spare parts arrived irregularly, when they arrived at all. Pilots slept in tents, ate captured Japanese rice, and flew aircraft that were technically unfit for combat operations by any reasonable maintenance standard. Major John L. Smith, commanding VMF 223, kept a daily log of aircraft status. August the 12th, 19 Wildcats assigned, 12 operational, 4 awaiting parts, 3 damaged beyond field repair. August 15th, 19 assigned, 8 operational, 7 awaiting parts, 4 destroyed. The numbers fluctuated based on daily combat, daily repairs, and the irregular arrival of replacement aircraft. Yet they kept flying. Captain Marion Carl, who would end the Guadalcanal campaign with 18.5 confirmed kills, described the operational tempo in a letter home. "We fly until something breaks or someone dies. Then we fix what broke and replace who died. The Japanese keep coming because they have to. We keep fighting because if we don't, the ships offshore die, and the Marines on the ground die, and Henderson Field gets retaken. So we fly." The Japanese faced their own mathematics. Every bomber lost over Guadalcanal represented not just lost aircraft, though at 800,000 yen per Betty, the economic cost was significant, but lost crews. A Betty carried 7 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio operator, and 3 gunners. Japan had begun the war with approximately 3,500 trained naval aircrew. That number was finite. Every crew lost over Guadalcanal was irreplaceable in any meaningful time frame. Training a bomber crew required 18 months. The war wouldn't wait 18 months. By mid-August, Japanese operational reports began noting a disturbing pattern. American fighters were becoming more effective. Not because American pilots were becoming more skilled, though they were, but because American tactics had evolved to exploit every Japanese weakness. A Japanese after-action report from August 16th, recovered post-war, noted, "Enemy fighters no longer attempt individual combat. They operate in coordinated pairs, refusing to separate. When engaged, one fighter breaks while the other attacks from an unexpected angle. Our pilots report that shooting down American fighters requires extended engagement, during which fuel is consumed and other enemy fighters arrive. The tactical situation is unsatisfactory." The report's language was bureaucratic, but the implication was stark. Japanese pilots couldn't win the kind of prolonged engagement necessary to destroy Wildcats without exhausting their fuel. The 10-minute combat window was insufficient against opponents who refused to fight predictably. August 20th, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Indian Joe Bauer, a Marine fighter ace, arrived at Henderson Field with 14 replacement Wildcats. His first briefing with Major Smith covered the tactical realities. "The Zeros will try to separate you," Smith said, pointing at a hand-drawn diagram on a salvaged chalkboard. "They'll feint at one pilot, trying to draw him into a turn. If he bites, he's dead. If he doesn't bite, they'll try someone else. Your job is to never bite. Stay with your wingman. If someone calls defensive, you break toward the threat. The weave isn't optional. It's how you survive." Bauer, who'd been flying fighters since 1935, asked the question that revealed how completely doctrine had transformed. "What about aggressive pursuit? Pressing attacks?" "You press attacks in pairs," Smith replied. "You pursue in pairs. You break off in pairs. The moment you're alone, you're vulnerable. The Zero can outturn you, so don't turn. It can't outdive you, so dive. It can't outshoot you, so shoot. And it can't take damage like you can, so make every burst count." Bauer nodded slowly. Everything in his training, everything in American fighter doctrine prior to 1942, emphasized individual initiative and aggressive tactics. What Smith was describing sounded almost passive. But the mathematics were undeniable. Pilots who followed these tactics survived. Pilots who didn't. By August 21st, Marine Air Group 23 had developed an operational pattern that maximized Henderson Field's defensive advantages while exploiting Japanese constraints. Coastwatcher warnings provided 30 minutes notice of incoming raids. Wildcats would launch, climb to 20,000 feet, and position themselves upsun of the expected Japanese approach. When the bombers appeared, fighters would dive through the Zero escorts, using superior diving speed to reach the bombers before Zeros could react, and make a single high-speed pass through the bomber formation. Then they'd dive away, extend to gain separation, and climb back for another pass. The Zeros would try to engage, but their 10-minute combat window meant they couldn't pursue extended stern chases. They had to break off and return to escort duty or risk running out of fuel over the ocean. American pilots, with unlimited fuel and friendly territory below, could make multiple passes, breaking off between attacks to regain altitude and position. The tactical mathematics favored persistence over individual brilliance. Lieutenant Colonel Bauer flew his first combat mission over Guadalcanal on August 22nd. His report, filed that evening, captured the reality. Made 4 separate attacks on a formation of 18 Betty bombers escorted by 30 Zeros. Each attack: dive from altitude, single high-speed pass, break away before Zeros can engage effectively. Shot down 1 Betty confirmed, 1 probable. Took minor damage from bomber defensive fire. Zero pilots attempted pursuit, but broke off after initial maneuvers, presumably fuel concerns. This tactic is effective but requires discipline. The temptation to engage Zeros directly is significant, must be resisted. The Japanese were learning the same lessons from the opposite perspective. A Japanese Navy report from late August, analyzing Guadalcanal operations, concluded, American fighter tactics exploit our operational constraints. Enemy fighters attack bombers during the limited time our escorts have fuel for combat. They refuse engagement that would allow our superior maneuverability to be decisive. They accept damage our aircraft cannot sustain. We are losing the exchange at unsustainable rates. The report's recommendation section suggested increasing fighter escort numbers, improving bomber defensive armament, and developing tactics to force American fighters into turning engagements. What it didn't suggest, couldn't suggest, was eliminating the fundamental constraint. 650 miles was too far to maintain decisive air superiority with single-engine fighters carrying 145 gallons of fuel. Geography and logistics were defeating tactical excellence. August 23rd, the night before the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Henderson Field's operational diary recorded 23 Wildcats operational, 14 pilots combat-ready, ammunition stocks sufficient for approximately 60 minutes of sustained combat per aircraft. Japanese intelligence, intercepted and decoded by American cryptanalysts, indicated a major operation planned for August 24th. Carrier-based aircraft would strike the American task force while land-based bombers from Rabaul hit Henderson Field simultaneously. The Japanese plan was sophisticated: divide American fighter strength between defending the carriers offshore and defending Henderson Field. Overwhelm both through numerical superiority. The carriers couldn't defend themselves and Henderson Field simultaneously. Something would have to give. What Japanese planners hadn't fully accounted for was that American fighter doctrine had evolved beyond what their intelligence assessments captured. The Wildcat wasn't the same aircraft, tactically, that had fought in the Philippines. The pilots weren't employing the same tactics that had failed at Wake Island. 8 months of continuous combat had produced a learning curve that Japanese analysis hadn't tracked. The Wildcat was still slower than the Zero, still couldn't turn with the Zero, still looked on paper like the inferior aircraft. But doctrine had transformed what inferior meant, and tomorrow, 72 Japanese aircraft would discover that paper specifications didn't determine combat outcomes. Flatley, aboard the Saratoga, reviewed the same intelligence: 19 operational Wildcats, 72 inbound Japanese aircraft, maybe more. The mathematics were unfavorable, but mathematics assumed equal tactics, equal doctrine, equal willingness to trade losses. The Japanese were about to discover that none of those assumptions still applied. August 24th, 1942. 1347 hours, 14,000 feet above the Solomon Sea. The radar plot aboard USS Saratoga showed what Lieutenant Commander Flatley already knew from visual contact: 72 aircraft inbound. The fighter direction officer's voice remained professionally calm, but the numbers spoke for themselves. 27 Betty bombers in 3 9-plane formations, escorted by 45 Zeros, 3 full Chutai of fighters operating in coordinated groups of 9 aircraft each. Against this force, 19 Wildcats. The mathematical disparity, 3.8 to 1, would have been considered operationally prohibitive in pre-war doctrine. Navy fighter direction manuals from 1940 recommended minimum parity for defensive operations, preferably 1.5.1 advantage for attackers. What those manuals hadn't anticipated was that the relevant ratio wasn't aircraft to aircraft, it was doctrine to doctrine. Flatley keyed his radio. All Scarlet aircraft, combat spread formation. Sections maintain 200-yard separation. We're going through the fighters to hit the bombers. First pass, dive attack, targeting lead elements. Break on my call. Reform at 8,000 feet. The 19 Wildcats split into 2 plane elements, 9.5 pairs, though Flatley flew alone as overall coordinator. Each pair positioned with geometric precision. 200 yards lateral separation, slight altitude stagger, close enough for mutual support, but far enough that a single attacking Zero couldn't engage both simultaneously. Japanese formation doctrine emphasized tight groupings, fighters in close 3-plane shotai, wingtip to wingtip, demonstrating formation flying discipline. It looked impressive. It also meant that when one aircraft maneuvered, all 3 had to adjust simultaneously. American combat spread sacrificed visual impressiveness for tactical flexibility. Each pair could maneuver independently while maintaining mutual support. The Zeros came up to meet them. Leading the Japanese fighter escort was Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, a veteran with 11 confirmed kills and 800 combat hours. Sasai had been flying Zeros since the China campaign in 1940, had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack, and had fought over the Philippines, Java, and New Guinea. He understood American tactics, or thought he did. The intelligence briefings he'd received described American fighters as employing defensive paired tactics, refusing individual engagement, relying on aircraft durability rather than pilot skill. What those briefings didn't capture was how completely American doctrine had evolved in 8 months of continuous combat refinement. Sasai led his 9-plane Chutai into a diving attack on Flatley's formation, expecting the American fighters to break defensively, to scatter, to create individual targets that superior Zero maneuverability could exploit. Instead, the Wildcats maintained formation, their paired elements weaving in coordinated patterns that created overlapping fields of fire. A Zero dove on Ensign Ericsson's Wildcat. Ericsson broke right, not away from the threat, but toward his section leader, Lieutenant J.G. John Kleinman. The turn brought both aircraft together, crossing paths. The Zero, committed to its attack on Ericsson, suddenly found itself flying perpendicular to Kleinman's guns. Kleinman fired a 2-second burst. 6 50-caliber machine guns, firing at 800 rounds per minute collectively, put approximately 160 rounds into the air. At 300 yards range, perhaps 30 rounds connected. For the Wildcats' heavy 50-caliber ammunition, each round weighing 1.7 ounces, traveling at 2,800 feet per second, 30 hits was catastrophic. The Zero's left wing separated at the root. The aircraft entered an uncontrollable roll, spinning downward, trailing fuel vapor that ignited at 8,000 feet. Sasai watched one of his pilots die in approximately 4 seconds of actual combat, faster than traditional dogfighting could have achieved, faster than Japanese tactical doctrine had prepared for. Flatley pressed his attack toward the bombers. The Zeros tried to intercept, but the Wildcat formation's geometry created a tactical problem Japanese doctrine hadn't solved. Engaging one American fighter meant exposing yourself to his wingman. Engaging the wingman meant the original target could maneuver into firing position. The only solution was coordinated attacks by multiple Zeros. But coordinating attacks required radio communication, and Japanese tactical radio discipline emphasized radio silence to prevent interception. The Betty bombers, meanwhile, maintained their tight V formations, doctrine designed for mutual defensive fire. Each Betty carried 4 7.7mm machine guns and one 20mm cannon, theoretically creating overlapping fields of fire that would force attacking fighters to break off or die. The theory assumed attackers would make slow, sustained approaches, trading fire with bomber gunners. Flatley dove at 350 knots, 100 knots faster than pre-war fighter doctrine considered safe for gunnery. At that speed, the Wildcats' control surfaces stiffened, making precise aiming difficult. But the speed also reduced exposure time to bomber defensive fire from 6 seconds to approximately 2 seconds. American pilots were accepting reduced accuracy in exchange for increased survivability. Flatley's 650 calibers opened fire at 400 yards, longer range than standard doctrine recommended, but the heavy bullets retained lethality at extended distances that lighter caliber weapons couldn't match. His tracers walked into the lead Betty's starboard engine. The engine cowling disintegrated, oil sprayed across the wing. The propeller seized, and the asymmetric drag pulled the bomber out of formation. Behind Flatley, Lieutenant Marion Carl and his wingman, Ensign G.L. Wren, made a coordinated attack on the same formation's second element. Carl fired into one Betty while Wren targeted another. The Japanese formation leader, attempting to maintain tight formation discipline, couldn't maneuver away without disrupting the entire group. The Bettys absorbed damage rather than breaking formation, a doctrinal decision that prioritized group cohesion over individual survival. Carl's target caught fire. The Betty didn't explode. Japanese bombers were more structurally robust than American pilots typically credited, but fire consuming the fuselage was effectively a kill. The crew would have perhaps 30 seconds before flames reached the bomb bay or fuel tanks. 7 men aboard. Maybe 2 would successfully bail out at this altitude. Probably none. The tactical mathematics were shifting in real time. 3 Betty bombers damaged or destroyed within 90 seconds. But the Japanese still had 24 operational bombers and 45 Zeros, and the Wildcats had expended approximately 15% of their ammunition. Sustaining this exchange rate required precisely the kind of tactical discipline that pre-war fighter doctrine considered incompatible with aggressive combat operations. Sasai, watching the American fighters break away and extend before the Zero escorts could engage effectively, recognized the tactical problem. The Americans were fighting a different kind of combat, one where engagement time was controlled by the attacker, where speed and discipline replaced maneuverability, where paired mutual support made individual Zero superiority irrelevant. He radioed his formation. Pursue the enemy fighters. Do not allow them to disengage. But do not allow required fuel the Zeros didn't have. Sasai's 9-plane Chutai had launched from carrier Shokaku at 12:15 hours. Current time, 1,351 hours. They'd been airborne 96 minutes, with another 90 minutes flight time to return to the carrier. That left approximately 60 minutes of fuel, perhaps 20 minutes at combat power, before they had to break off and conserve fuel for the return flight. The Wildcats, operating from carriers 60 miles away, could fight until their ammunition was exhausted. The Zeros had to preserve enough fuel to get home. Tactical advantage belonged to whoever could sustain operations longest. Flatley reformed his fighters at 8,000 feet, conducting a rapid tactical assessment. Visual inspection of his formation, 17 Wildcats still operational. 2 had sustained damage requiring immediate return to carrier. Ammunition remaining, approximately 70% across the formation. Fuel, adequate for another 40 minutes of combat operations. He keyed his radio. Second pass. Same tactics. Hit the bombers, break before the Zeros can establish pursuit. We're going to keep doing this until either they break off or we run out of ammunition. The Japanese formation had tightened after the first attack. Bombers closing intervals, Zeros positioning more densely above and around the bomber stream. Standard response to fighter attack. But tightening formation increased vulnerability to coordinated strikes while providing minimal additional defensive advantage against high-speed diving attacks. The Wildcats dove again. This time, Sasai attempted to intercept before American fighters reached the bombers. His Chutai dove to meet Flatley's formation, Zeros positioning for head-on passes, a tactic that negated American tactical advantages by creating simultaneous engagement where neither side could disengage cleanly. Flatley recognized the geometry. Head-on passes were dangerous, both aircraft closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 knots, engagement window measured in fractions of a second. But they also allowed Wildcat pilots to exploit their aircraft's superior structural strength and armor protection. The formations converged. Flatley fired at the lead Zero while simultaneously taking fire from the same aircraft. Rounds hammered into his Wildcat's engine cowling, 7.7mm machine gun fire from the Zero's wing-mounted guns. The Wildcat's armor plate, positioned behind the engine and in front of the cockpit, absorbed the impact. The engine, a Pratt & Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp, 14 cylinders of air-cooled radial robustness, continued operating despite multiple hits. Flatley's return fire struck the Zero's center line. The Japanese fighter, lacking armor or self-sealing fuel tanks, absorbed damage directly into critical systems. The Zero pulled up sharply, whether from pilot input or control damage Flatley couldn't determine, and stalled. It fell away, trailing smoke. The cost-benefit analysis played out in mechanical terms. The Wildcat absorbed damage and continued fighting. The Zero absorbed damage and died. Over hundreds of engagements, that differential became decisive. Ensign Erickson, still flying as Kleinman's wingman, made his third attack run on the bomber formation. His previous 2 attacks had scored hits without confirmed kills, bomber defensive fire and his own inexperience making precision difficult. This time, he held fire until 300 yards, compensating for closure rate and deflection angle, then fired a sustained 4-second burst. Approximately 320 rounds, approximately 75 hits. The Betty bomber's port wing fuel tank ruptured. JP fuel, Japanese aviation gasoline stored in unprotected tanks, ignited instantly. The bomber's wing folded upward, structural failure from fire damage, and the aircraft entered an inverted spin. Erickson broke hard right, as briefed. Kleinman, covering the brake, fired at a Zero attempting to pursue Erickson's turn. The Zero broke off. The paired Wildcats extended, gained separation, prepared for another attack. By 14:05 hours, 18 minutes into the engagement, the tactical calculus had shifted definitively. The Japanese had lost 7 bombers destroyed, 4 damaged and leaving formation, and 9 Zeros either destroyed or damaged sufficiently to abort operations. 37% of their bomber force, 20% of their fighter escort. The Wildcats had lost 3 aircraft, 1 to combat damage requiring carrier landing with landing gear damage, 2 to mechanical failures exacerbated by sustained combat operations. 16 fighters still operational. Sasai, watching his formation's cohesion deteriorate and calculating fuel states, faced the decision that operational mathematics demanded: continue attacking and risk not having sufficient fuel to return to carrier, or break off engagement while enough fuel remained for safe return. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized offensive spirit, attacking aggressively regardless of cost, achieving objectives through willpower and sacrifice. American doctrine increasingly emphasized sustainable operations, accepting temporary tactical retreats to preserve forces for continued operations. At 14:09 hours, Sasai ordered his remaining fighters to break off engagement and established defensive escort around the surviving bombers. The American fighters made 2 more diving passes, shooting down an additional 3 bombers, before Flatley ordered his formation to return to Saratoga. Ammunition states across the Wildcat formation averaged 25% remaining, sufficient for defensive operations during return flight, insufficient for sustained offensive action. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons would continue for 2 more days, involving multiple carrier strikes and surface engagements. But this 18-minute fighter engagement, 19 Wildcats against 72 Japanese aircraft, had demonstrated something that would reshape Pacific air combat doctrine for the remainder of the war. Technical specifications didn't determine combat outcomes. Doctrine did. The Zero remained faster in level flight, more maneuverable in turns, longer-ranged in ferry configuration. On paper, it remained the superior fighter aircraft. But warfare wasn't conducted on paper. It was conducted by pilots executing tactical doctrines that either exploited their aircraft's advantages or suffered their disadvantages. American pilots, flying obsolete Wildcats, had developed tactical doctrine that made the Zero's advantages irrelevant while ruthlessly exploiting its weaknesses. Japanese pilots, flying superior aircraft, executed tactical doctrine that hadn't evolved to counter American tactical innovations. By late August 1942, the exchange ratio over the Solomons had shifted to near parity. By October, American fighters were achieving favorable exchange ratios. By 1943, the ratio would approach 2-1 in American favor, not because American aircraft had improved dramatically, but because American tactical doctrine had created conditions where their aircraft's advantages determined engagement outcomes. Flatley's formation landed aboard Saratoga between 14:45 and 15:10 hours. 16 Wildcats trapped successfully. The 17th made it back, but had to ditch alongside a destroyer. Pilot recovered uninjured, aircraft lost. In the ready room debriefing, intelligence officers compiled the results. 14 confirmed kills, 10 bombers, 4 fighters, 7 probables, against 19 fighters engaging 72 enemy aircraft for 18 minutes of sustained combat. The Imperial Japanese Navy's after-action report, decoded by American intelligence 3 days later, described the engagement as tactically inconclusive, with moderate losses inflicted on enemy carrier forces. It made no mention of the tactical evolution that had occurred, no analysis of why Japanese numerical superiority had failed to achieve decisive results. The Americans were learning. The Japanese were still assuming their opponents were the same pilots, flying the same tactics, making the same mistakes as 8 months previous. That assumption would cost them the Pacific War.